Good evening to our Friday Beat the Press edition of Greater Boston. Our topics: after a year, the Jena 6 story makes its way to the mainstream media. Howie Carr loses a court case to jump ship to WTKK. A British poll saying 1.2 million killed since the start of the war gets little notice. And Dan Rather sues CBS News. Joining me are John Carroll of Beat the Press and Boston University, television commentator Callie Crosley, Joe Shaka of the Boston Herald, and Dan Kennedy of Northeastern University. First, the Jena 6. The story is a year old. It's been written and talked about on African-American websites, publications, and talk radio shows. But it only hit the mainstream press this week. At issue, how the Louisiana community handled the arrest of 6 black teens accused of beating a white classmate versus how the town handled white kids who hung nooses from a so-called whites-only tree on school property. The tiny rural town of Jena, Louisiana, population 3,500 and predominantly white, was overwhelmed yesterday by some 10,000 protesters, mostly black.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
The Jena 6 protest led the NBC and ABC newscasts last night.
They've gathered in the name of race and civil rights and justice.
CNN devoted an hour-long special to the case. Still, this story has been very slow to hit the mainstream media.
The story of the Jena 6 first spread on the internet, then to black urban radio.
The Jena saga has become a new chapter in the civil rights movement, in part because of its extensive exposure on the internet by black bloggers, a group that was virtually non-existent a year ago.
The story was fueled daily by black bloggers and black radio stations. The NABJ spread the word to news organizations, and black entertainment television encouraged people to protest, as did the peripatetic Al Sharpton.
We sit and stand in a city that says it's a prank to hang a hangman's noose, but that it is attempted murder to have a fight.
In fairness, the story has not been entirely ignored by the mainstream press. CNN ran 75 stories over the past year. But it is fair to say it really didn't catch mainstream America's attention until this week. This is fascinating to me, largely because it came from the blogosphere, something that we've talked about a lot here, and how not only are they breaking news, but they're bringing stories to the forefront. And this is an example of a case that probably never would have gotten out of sort of the local news realm. Now, on the other hand, I have serious doubts in my mind about whether it deserved that. This kind of a protest is always going to attract that kind of attention nationwide. But whether the story itself deserved to be pushed to the forefront, not so sure.
Well, this is a terrible injustice, even if Al Sharpton says it's a terrible injustice. But one of the other things that's interesting about this, not only the role of African-American bloggers, but also of young people, because we know that young people, studies show that they don't pay an awful lot of attention to the news, but this is one of those stories that's really caught on in a big way on Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, exactly the places that young people go. There are hundreds of groups that have been formed on those social networks trying to get young people excited about this, and it's a really interesting way of a new form of news media and how young people are connecting with that, and that's got a lot to do with why this has bubbled up. You know, how this became a national story, I certainly think that's part of it.
Well, how it became a national story is because a lot of people have been protesting and talking about it. I mean, that's why it's getting the attention. If it hadn't been building the groundswell, it would have just stayed where it was as a small. So that's what made mainstream media become very interested in it and continue to be interested. And certainly here in Boston, the Radio 1 talk show hosts have been beating the Jena 6 drum. I mean, one guy, Warren Ballantyne, just essentially sat on the radio one day and said, I'm going down the list, and if you are not there to stand up at finally, you know, I'm going to call your name out here on the radio. I mean, it's pretty powerful. He's talking about organizations and people standing up, you know, not individuals. But so with that, I think, of course, it's interesting, and it's an organizing strategy that's totally different. And Dan is right. The young people, the college students, I saw one guy interviewed saying, gee, you know, when protests have started in this country, they usually have started on the college campuses. Maybe it's been dormant, but, you know, we feel like this is a time where we can stand up with some people who are facing some injustices that might have just gone undercover if it hadn't been talked about in this way.
The spark, obviously, of this story was talk radio, and that kind of crusading talk radio, talking about Cali. And then, of course, the fire of it really spread on the internet and the various social networking sites. People heard about it. But, you know, there's one story, which is the tens of thousands of people showing up at the protest, and that's sort of one story. But I'm not sure when we get past that huge event, what's there. I mean, it still seems to me to be very convoluted in terms of what happened, who's to blame, how much fault there is. You know, I have a hard time believing local officials when they say, you know, they hang nooses from the tree and then they simply cut down the tree and the problem is over. That's what they did. You know, and they couldn't charge the white youths who did that. There's a real investigation that's needed here. Hopefully the local press there will play the leading role in terms of doing it. I just hope that we don't get caught up in the sort of theatrics of the protest and see that as a story as opposed to what really happened.
Well, there's another group here, too, which is the school officials. And the question was, what do you do with these students who hung the nooses on the tree? The principal wanted them expelled. The superintendent stepped in and said, no, let's just suspend them, and then this will quiet down. And it didn't quiet down. And sort of that sort of blew up in their faces. The other mainstream media that actually did do serious work on this story were NPR and the Washington Post. And it's no accident that the news outlets that sort of major in in-depth coverage were on this story, and the rest of them weren't.
All after June, though, of this year.
Well,
all of them. So they got pushed to it by all these.
Right, but still 3 months three months ahead of everybody else, and I think that says something about the quality of the news gathering there. But the internet, I mean, it just takes off on its own. It becomes a runaway train for good or ill. And it can work both ways.
How does anybody feel that, though? I mean, the NABJ becoming an advocacy arm for this, and frankly, BET, I didn't hear this myself, but one of our producers heard BET calling, not talking about within the context of a newscast, calling for people to participate in the protest, you know, join the outrage. I mean, is this...
BET doesn't have a newscast, so that's the first thing. So it's
apparently
outside
they do. They do on the weekends.
No, they have some news. So they don't really have a newscast. They don't even, so that's outside the realm of that. Yeah. With NABJ's part of its role is to represent the interest of, you know, black journalists. And so when the story came out, it was to do the story. And it's back to what Joe said. It's to do all of the parts of the story, not just the protests. I mean, that's what Ernie Suggs, the vice president of print, was saying. There are some stories here about the system itself. There's some stories here about what actually happened. I mean, one of the things that got a lot of protesters fired up is that in the prosecutor's case, he's saying that a tennis shoe was a weapon. And people are saying, come on, you know, that's just like, but these are the kinds of things that, you know, should be examined, and that's what NABJ was saying.
And I don't have any problem with crusading journalism either. I mean, I think that, you know, if a talk radio host uses that platform to promote it, or a blogger does in crusade, or a newspaper does, or a TV journalist, we sat here and praised Dan Ray with the Joe Salvati thing, crusading on that issue and bringing it to light. Sometimes it takes that kind of like pushing behind the story to get everybody else to pay attention.
But we also talked about how tricky that was,
yes.
and, with Dan Ray and with everybody else. And I agree, the media should be urged to continue to do something about this and to look into this, as well as Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton should be urged to continue to be active about this, because I mean, I haven't seen Al Sharpton doing anything about the Don Imus situation since the Don Imus situation, and that was going to be a crusade for him. So I would like to see them do it as well, and I think they have a shared responsibility.
Well, that's actually not true. He's actually doing a lot. He's been doing a lot with his National Action Network on that front. It just doesn't get covered, but he's doing it. But that's all I can tell you.
By the way, in the hearing today, Michael Bell, the remaining of the Jena 6, is still behind bars. He's not going to be released today, but they haven't said when or if he will be.
And that's the whole point, because the kid should, according to many, should not have been charged as an adult.